South African Sign Language Bill signed into law in July of this year. It was great news. The presidency hailed the official recognition of sign language as a very important step in realizing the rights of those who are deaf or hard of hearing. Now, September is Deaf Awareness Month, so we're looking at ways to be more inclusive. I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out how do we make it more inclusive. The deaf community in our everyday life struggle with the very basics, like, for example, probably watching this news broadcast right now. Sarah Coutts is South African Sign Language Program Coordinator at the Wits Plus Language School, and joining us now. Hello to you, Sarah. I believe you offer some courses as well. We'll get to that in a second, but just how significant was it when this was signed into law? How did the deaf community react to that?
Morning, Gareth. So I think that describing the significance, there are no words. It has been so many years in the making. There have been so many people and organizations behind the scenes who have been campaigning and promoting and motivating for it. And what was particularly wonderful was that when it was signed into law, it was just after the World Federation for the Deaf conference, which is held every 4 years. And I had actually just returned from that conference when it was signed into law. So that was really great to hear. And it was really well timed.
But apart from having to now learn sign language, or you should be learning sign language as an official language, how do we try and integrate sign language into South African culture? I mean, I made the reference right now, someone hard of hearing, someone deaf, is not even able to hear our discussion. This is the irony of the interview that we're doing. How do we as a society, technologically, just everyday life, how do we try and integrate this now?
So I think there are two things that need to be considered. And the first is always to try and provide access in the language as well, which is obviously the ideal, but given the multilingual diversity in South Africa, it's not always the most practical. So I think that the second one is to recognize that there is a need for the communication and that there's a need for another language. And one of the foremost ways of doing that is through interpreters, making sure that the quality of the interpreters being used is consistent and at a high standard. Not somebody who has an intermediate level of sign language or basic understanding, but somebody who really understands the language, understands the culture, and can communicate. Yeah. And part of that is using deaf interpreters. So you would have a hearing interpreter feeding a deaf person who is a deaf interpreter, who then relays that into sign language that is more accessible. And I think that another part of that is just acknowledging that there is a need for that communication. If you go into a bank or a police station or a shop and you want to do just a basic everyday service, the responsibility for communication should not always be on the deaf person. It's a two-way street and it requires meeting them in the middle. So it's not good enough just to say to somebody, oh, you're deaf, write down everything, and then talk while they're doing it, because that's disrespectful. Give them the same respect, acknowledge that you have a person in front of you, and try to mediate that communication as much as possible, even if it's through gestures.
It's very interesting because I'm not sure if maybe you'll know the names, but viewers of eTV and eNCA will know two of our sign language interpreters, Andiswa and Pologo, both very vocal advocates for sign language interpretation. And I did an interview with Andiswa probably this time last year, might have been the year before, for September, Deaf Awareness Month. And she had such a nice way of phrasing this because her parents are deaf. That's public knowledge. I'm not sharing a secret. And the way she described it is often we'll have, when there's live broadcasts on a national terrestrial channel, you'll have the sign language interpreter box. And she uses that as an example, that the box needs to be made bigger because the way she looks at that is the box is the volume for the deaf community. It's like us putting the volume up now as you and I talk. It's things like that. Are we very good at that as the South African media and broadcasters? Are we accessible to those who are deaf and hard of hearing?
I think some broadcasters are more sensitive to it than others. On a national level, unfortunately, no. I think that there's a lot more that needs to be done. You know, looking at at the box as an example, looking at the framing in this call, you know, having your head and shoulders is fine when you're speaking, but what about the signs that get done in front of your body? lower at your hip level.
Yeah.
How does somebody see that? How do you see a box that is essentially this big on the screen when you need to see the hand movements and the facial expression?
Yeah.
So, no, there's definitely a lot of room for improvements.
I'm glad that you brought it up, because I think it is something that needs to be focused on as well. I'm going to start saying goodbye in a moment, but before I do that, let's make sure that everyone understands it's now an official language. We know that. How do we start to learn sign language? You spoke earlier about interpreters. They need to be, officially trained. I imagine that includes some kind of postgraduate degree or some kind of eNCA framework. But for those of us who want to learn sign language, where's the place to go? There feels like there's an app for everything these days.
So there's no single app that can be used. There's still a lot of development happening in South African Sign Language. So the best is to do a in-person course, whether you are doing it online with live sessions or you're doing it in a classroom with your peers, because any language requires use of the language. And then interact with deaf people. Look at your deaf communities, try to make friends and reach out. Just as a starting point, learn how to say hello to everybody and to introduce yourself. So, for example, hi, my name is Sarah, and I have a sign name, which is this. So just starting to make those small steps and, learn a couple of signs. There's lots of videos on YouTube. There are apps. And just start using it, because the more you use the language and try to communicate with people, the more they want to help you learn the language. And of course, you can also come and register for a full-time, not a full-time, but an actual course, which is 10 weeks at Wits Language School. And that is 40 hours, and then go from there.
There you go. I was about to say, that's got to be the way, I think, to do this as well. You can't just leave us to our devices. We'll never be able to understand what we're doing. So Wits Language School is the way to go. Very, very quickly, I want to say thank you, but I want to say thank you in sign language. Sarah, how do I do that?
Thank you.
Sarah Coutts, thank you very much. From the South African Sign Language Program Coordinator at the Wits Plus Language School. It's a great skill to learn, and it is now an official language in South Africa. So very, very important as well.